Today I want to talk a little bit about Osugi Sakai and other early Japanese socialists and explore a history of left-wing politics in the island nation. On September 1st, 1923, an 8.0 earthquake struck the Kanto Plains, absolutely devastating Tokyo and the surrounding country. In the immediate aftermath, small fires around the Kanto Plain were spread by a tropical cyclone. Almost all of Yokohama Port and more than half of Tokyo were destroyed, leaving between 100 and 150,000 dead, as well as over 2 million homeless and tens of thousands missing, presumed killed. Unfortunately for the people, elements within the military and police saw the disaster as a convenient way to get rid of certain societal elements they weren't too fond of. Osugi Sakai was a prominent anarchist, a Christian pacifist, and a supporter of workers' rights, exactly the kind of man the powers that be would want to sweep under the rug. I'm here on Japan's Pacific coast at a Buddhist cemetery to show you the grave of Osugi Sakai, an assassinated left-wing socialist activist that was killed in the 1923 earthquake. I'll tell you a little bit more about that, but I wanted to point out to my viewers, who I notice in the algorithm fall squarely in the most conservative demographic, that even though we're in a Buddhist cemetery, most of Japan's early socialists were the opposite of what you would expect of a socialist today. By and large, including Osugi, they were Christian because Christianity preached forgiveness. It preached that the lower classes of people were all equal before the eyes of God. And even though we're in a Buddhist cemetery, this cross looks over the graves in this plot. As a young man, he attended military school, but was soon expelled after a series of incidents following questions about his sexuality and a fight with a fellow student. By 1902, Osugi had returned to Tokyo and discovered that his mother was sick. She would die later that year, and a young Sakai did some soul-searching. Like many others who found themselves in a rough spot, he experimented with Christianity, whose core message of forgiveness spoke volumes to men like Osugi Sakai, whose families were said to be suffering for their own actions. Unlike a lot of people in Japan, he viewed, and many others believed, that their sins were already atoned for. Many of them are buried in the same graveyard, Japanese Christians in the port town of Shizuoka, southwest of Tokyo. After enrolling in a foreign language school, he joined a socialist club called Heimin Sha, which printed the increasingly popular Heimin Shinbun, or the Commoner's News. This was a nucleus of the early left-wing movement. This club was formed in November of 1903, at a time when the whole world could see the Russo-Japanese War hurtling ever closer. Another friend of this group was Shanshiro Ishikawa, a socialist who had fully embraced a fusion of Karl Marx with Christianity. However, like many radicals, even on the far left, nationalism overshadowed progressive ideals, and the socialist paper that Ishikawa had helped to publish began supporting the Japanese war effort. Both Ishikawa and Shizui had been editors of that paper, but resigned in protest, creating Heimin Shinbun as a pacifist alternative. Now back to the man of the hour, Osugi Sakai. It was while he was mingling with the Heimin Sha Club that he met a fellow traveler and became an Esperanto teacher. The young couple was soon to be married, and their idea was to introduce a global language, something early socialists and anarchists hoped would create a worldwide community of brotherhood and sisterhood. Shortly after marrying, Osugi was sent to jail for publishing seditious materials in 1907. In 1908, he was again sentenced to time behind bars, twice, the second time for the Red Flag incident. In June, the popular anarchist Koken Yamaguchi was released from prison to be greeted by a crowd waving red flags. Police had good intelligence and were already preparing to swoop in on the main organizers, including Osugi Sakai, who was given the longest prison sentence of the group at just over 2 years. By now, authorities were doing everything they could to target leftists, and the following year, the high treason incident took place. 24 anarchists, as we already mentioned, were sentenced to death, but only 12 executions were carried out. Many saw the trial as a farce when the government implicated men in jail who were already behind bars for the Red Flag case, but let them off because there's no way they could have taken part in this conspiracy from behind bars. Osugi's father died while he was locked up, and after his release he began affairs with Ichiki Kamichika and Ito Nue. This seemed to be more of a free-love polyamorous relationship for a while, but in 1916, when Ito Nue moved from her family to live with Osugi, by 1917, Osugi's legal wife divorced him and he was living with Ito and their baby daughter. In 1920, Osugi was contacted by Korean communists who wanted him to attend the Shanghai Congress of Far Eastern Socialists, a congress that was hosted by Communist International. Having sparked his interest in Korean labor, Osugi then traveled back to Osaka in 1922 to organize port labor, and in early 1923 journeyed to Berlin for the International Congress of Anarchists. Sadly, he was arrested at Saint Denis on May Day for the demonstration just outside of Paris. This was before he could finish the trip. His fate was sealed when they deported him back to Japan in mid-1923. By September of that year, Osugi and Ito were live-in partners with their 4 daughters, and he continued publishing leftist literature. The Great Kanto earthquake struck at just before noon on the 1st. And in the same cemetery as the young child Tachibana, you have a newer monument to the victims of the Kanto earthquake. Vigilantes and gangsters immediately began settling scores, but this quickly grew into racially motivated violence, especially directed towards Koreans. The peninsula had been under Japanese rule since 1910, and poor laborers were often working in port towns like this one, taking much less for their labor than Japanese workers. In exchange, they lived as second-class citizens, but men like Osugi were constantly trying to organize them and fighting for their rights. Police acted independent of command. Ill feelings began hours after the earthquake when a union of ethnic Korean dockyard workers, led by Japanese socialists, started to provide food and water for the local neighborhood. Organizers sent union men into the rubble in search of food and water from abandoned buildings, and then helped distribute it to whoever needed it the most. By that night, police chief of Kanagawa Prefecture gave district chiefs unknown orders, which he insisted later he forgot, on how to deal with this emergency. He did say towards the end of his life that he may have suggested that radical Korean elements would exacerbate their problems, and that it should be dealt with. Multiple witnesses reported that officers from many districts fanned out, telling locals that it was now legal to kill Koreans. False rumors were introduced claiming the Korean laborers were lighting fires and poisoning the wells. They were also poisoning the food supply, apparently. From the 2nd to the 9th, vigilante bands spread out, openly fearful that Koreans were taking revenge on them for how they'd been treated as second-class citizens. In something that sounds akin to Rwanda, the mobs used mostly bats, bamboo poles, and swords. The Imperial Army joined up with the vigilantes, burning the victims in piles. Up to 90% of Yokohama's Korean population disappeared, and estimates range between 6,000 and 9,000. Meanwhile, the police were carrying out far more targeted killings. On the 16th, they arrived at Osugi Sakai's home and placed him and his common-law wife Ito Nue under arrest. Police Lieutenant Masahiko Amakasu also took Osugi's 6-year-old nephew, Soichi Tachibana. Accounts of the extrajudicial killings vary, but some claim that the murders were strangulations in their cells, while others maintain they were led into the woods and beaten to death. All agree that the killings were brutal and targeted, led by Lieutenant Amakasu. The 3 victims were then thrown into a well by the MPs on Amakasu's orders. Leftists in Japan were outraged and tried to get the U.S. to intervene because Osugi's nephew was a dual U.S.-Japanese citizen, having been born in Portland to Japanese parents. The embassy refused to listen to Osugi's sister, but issued a short statement to the papers. It read, quote, "In the case even of an unquestioned American citizen involved in trial in a foreign court, the law of that country must take its course, and we can only be interested in seeing that the trial is fair and the law impartially applied." Because all men involved were MPs in the Imperial Army, Lieutenant Amakasu and 4 of his soldiers were court-martialed. Throughout the trial, defendants argued that he was forced to kill Ito and Usugi out of an irresistible urge to protect the empire. Killing the child, they said, was justified if he would only grow up to be a socialist anyway. Reportedly cheered, and the prosecutor and judge gave very lenient sentences when they had to, but acquitted 3 of the 5 men. Amakasu was released under amnesty in late 1926, after which he became a special agent in Manchuria. In August 1945, he got to meet the child he murdered when Soviet troops breached his base and he bit down on a cyanide capsule. And in keeping with the idea that the Japanese Communist Party is not a very celebrated party, but at least a tolerated one here in Japan, especially in rural areas, the same kinds of areas that would be incredibly conservative in the United States, I've come out here to a place I haven't seen anything about on English language sources on the internet, the birthplace of Sen Katayama. I'll tell you a little bit more about him, but if we pan the camera around over here, you've got a bit of information about his life, and on that rock, it says that it's been dedicated by members of the Communist Party of this prefecture. These are the graves of Japanese Communist Party members who wanted to be buried near Sen Katayama. With 2 generations of the most capable anarchists in the ground, the leftist movement in Japan was set adrift. The free love of Ito and Usugi was replaced by the radicalism of men like Sen Katayama, who's commemorated here with some very interesting and very openly communist monuments. Born Sugataro in 1859, his first experience with the cruelties of the world came when his father abandoned the family. Because the Yabukis were a working-class family, his mother couldn't afford to raise him, and so he was adopted by the Katayama family in the Okayama prefecture. Their graves are on a hill overlooking this museum. He took the name Sen, and the adoption became official when he was 19 years old. This also avoided conscription and allowed him to focus on his studies, which he did throughout the 1870s. In Tokyo, he became lifelong friends with a fellow student, Iwakasi Kiyoshichi, nephew of one of Mitsubishi's founders. When he heard Iwakasi was going to Yale to study law, Sen wanted to follow him but knew he'd have to work his way there. By pulling himself up by his communist bootstraps, a young Sen Katayama began studying in Maryville in eastern Tennessee before moving to Iowa's Grinnell College. By the early 1900s, he'd graduated from Yale Divinity School and, much like Usugi, considered himself a Christian socialist. And directly in front of Katayama's house, you've got this monument to the 75th anniversary of the party's founding. He returned to Japan and founded the Social Democrat Party, the first socialist party in the country that was legal, but was forced to disband it 1 day later by the government. 5 of the 6 men to form this party were Christians themselves. Soon, Sen's old friend Iwasaki begged him to return to America and tried to get him to become an entrepreneur, ensuring him that there was an untapped market for rice cultivation. In 1904, he attended an American Socialist Party convention in Chicago, after which he moved to Texas with some financial help from Iwasaki, but poor investments, political disagreements, and bad crops followed him until he again had to flee to Japan. From 1907 until his arrest again in 1912 for participating in the streetcar strike, he was in Japan studying journalism and participating in the socialist movement. After being released, he traveled to California, where he remained for a little while. He then grew interested in the communist movement in Russia, the Bolshevik uprising of 1917 and 1918, becoming an officer in Comintern and moving to Mexico, and finally to Moscow. He was hailed as a Japanese communist revolutionary upon his death in 1933 by his friends in the Soviet Union and in Chicago by acquaintances of Communist Party USA, a party he helped to form and was a very early member of. His ashes are still interred in the Kremlin Wall necropolis, but he's also memorialized in the Aoyama Cemetery in Tokyo with his own headstone. He was not a well-known figure in Japan itself, but had a widespread base and plenty of memorable supporters in the Midwest and in Russia.